So welcome to the Drivers of Homelessness presentation today. And we're coming to you from Greater Victoria, where we've been working on heat vulnerability and heat dome fact sheets in the middle of the coldest spring and summer yet. So we're very excited to be launching this report today with people from all the way across the country, actually. We're just letting a few more people into the room and we'll start doing our report findings. Okay, maybe it's a good time to get started now. I know that people are still joining into the room, so we'll just start with an overview of what we're talking about today. The Drivers of Homelessness is a report that we've launched based on homelessness and housing insecurity in the region. And today what we're doing is having a dialogue around the findings, and we'll share an overview of the findings and then we'll have a discussion. First, the acknowledgement of our territories. We're on the lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees, the Esquimalt, Sartlip, Sakem, Sawtoo, Pakachin, Suk, Sierra-New, Patchadit nations, all of whom have a historical and ongoing relationship to the land where our offices and work are based. We do ask that folks that are coming in for other regions, please put your land acknowledgement into the chat, and we can acknowledge the lands and territories that all of the folks in the room are coming to. And just in terms of reconciliation, we try to ensure that we bring not just a land acknowledgement to our work, but also a reconciliation perspective, and try to ensure there's an Indigenous lens on the work we've done. And the Indigenous populations are disproportionately represented in the people that we work with in our programs. And our report has pulled out and done an analysis of the Indigenous impacts, but recognizing that colonialism is a huge driver of homelessness and that a lot more engagement is going to be needed around resolving housing insecurity for folks with a colonial legacy. Slide. So what we're going to do today is we'll have a presentation. I want to acknowledge our report authors, Nicole Chaland and Max Novotny, who are in the room. Hopefully, I think Nicole's with us today. And really a big shout out to Nicole for spearheading a lot of this research. And Max will be doing a presentation today about the findings. And then we will have a brief Q&A. We ask you to keep that. We'll have a Q&A at the end after our panel guests. So we'd like to keep the Q&A after the report specifically to any clarification points related to the report findings. Then we'll move to our panel speakers. I'll introduce them at that time. That will be doing a response to the report from BC and nationally. And then we'll have a final discussion before we close. This session goes till 1:30. And now I'll introduce Matt. Oh, first, before I introduce our speaker, I'll just say a little bit about the Community Social Planning Council. For those who aren't familiar with social planning councils, we were organized all the way across the country in the 1930s, and we've been operational for over 85 years in the region. There's 2 other community social planning councils on the island. We work to support social well-being through community dialogues like the one we're having today, participatory action research like the report really releasing today, and supporting regional planning with best practices and evidence, which we hope that conversations following up on this report will do. We also deliver programs, just before we move on, we also deliver programs and services, which I'm not sure people are familiar with. We have the Housing Security and Rent Bank program and Housing Security Grants program. So this is where the data from this really draws from our homelessness prevention programs. And we also have an ID services where we're supporting individuals who've had their ID lost or stolen. And then we have a low-income transit assistance program that provides passes and tickets to individuals in low-income accessing programs and services in the region. And beyond that, of course, we have our community programming and research. And now, slide. And now I'll introduce Max, who's going to speak to the methods of the report. This is Max Novotny, with a background in sociology and experience working on qualitative research in the streets of Edmonton around opioid and addictions. He comes to us with a great experience and skill and has led this research with Nicole Chaland. Max, take it away.
Thanks so much, Diana, and thank you everyone for coming. This is a really great opportunity to engage with you folks about our research and our programming, and to start thinking about action that we need to take in the future in the face of this ongoing housing crisis and increased precarity that we're facing in our region. So I'll just start off talking about the report, just in terms of a broad overview of what we are trying to achieve, and give a simple overview of the methods and data that we are drawing from. So the overall strategy was to explore and analyze quantitative and qualitative data collected by our homelessness prevention programs. So this is made up of two programs, the Greater Victoria Rent Bank, which is funded by BC Rent Bank, and the Housing Stability Grants Program. So the broadly eviction prevention programs, we provide emergency financial assistance to people in housing crisis. We have two data sources that we were drawing from. One was, one source is the pre-assessment data that all applicants to our programs filled out upon applying for our services. And the second is from a housing stability survey that we did 6 months after providing services to some of our participants. So yeah, in the pre-assessment form, we were asking things about reasons for applying, housing status, housing composition, income levels and sources, and current housing and living expenses. And the survey was more concerned about the evaluating program effectiveness in stabilizing housing, and as well as some kind of additional details about the composition of who we are providing services to. Yeah. So our framework, we were lucky enough to have Erin here today speaking on the panel, but we were drawing from a framework by Getz and Day. It's a causal model of homelessness. So our data really, it considers structural systems failures and individual factors. And our data really speaks to how, using this framework, we can talk about how structural factors and systems failures kind of work together to create inequalities and barriers that allow personal crises to put people at risk of losing their homes. So that's a general framework that we'll be talking about today. Some important findings. This is mostly about the efficacy of our programs and the needs for it. So as you can see here, the data is quite striking in that the majority of respondents to our survey self-report that they would have likely experienced a form of homelessness if they had not received our assistance. Most of whom reported likely experience absolute homelessness at 61%. So it's important to note here that we use the Canadian definition of homelessness, which goes beyond just absolute homelessness and considers provisional accommodation, things like couch surfing and inadequate housing. So just to summarize our program impact, it's quite evident that not only did this intervention connect with people in housing crisis, but that it connected with individuals and families who are at risk of homelessness, and that it prevented them, in the majority of cases, from entering homelessness. And now onto more of what our data speaks to the drivers of homelessness, what's driving people into our programs, and what is putting them at risk of homelessness. Here are some of the structural factors that we were able to derive from our data, and I'll go through each one. So one of the most prominent reasons, structural factors laying behind driving people to our programs, was unaffordable housing. So as you can see here, 96.5% of people pay more than 30% of income on their rent. 77.5% paid more than 50% of their income on rent. So we know from the literature that lack of safe and affordable housing is a key driver of homelessness. These measures right here are based on CMHC's definition of core housing need, which is based on individuals and families that pay more than 30% of their income on housing, and extreme core housing need at 50% for those who pay more than 50% of their income on rent. So program participants are much more likely to be in core housing need than the general population. These numbers compared to the general population would be about 14% of people in the capital region who are in core housing need and 8.6% in extreme core housing need. Important to note as well that those numbers are from 2018, and I'm sure the situation is much different nowadays. Another very important structural factor that we looked at was poverty. So 69% of all of our participants have incomes lower than Canada's official poverty line. Homelessness in itself is an extreme form of poverty, as a temporal state of living without basic needs being met. As you know, I'm sure poverty and homelessness are strongly correlated. Poverty and insufficient income increase the likelihood that an individual or family may experience homelessness. So also important to note here is that particular groups are susceptible to being in poverty and overrepresented in poverty. So single people, people living with disabilities, children, recent immigrants, people of color, and Indigenous people are more likely to be affected by poverty, and the impacts of poverty are often more extreme for those groups. And just a note here, Canada's official poverty line is based on a market basket measure, which really is only based on the basic needs that a person needs to live. Whereas CSPC has calculated a living wage for the region, which is much higher and attests to an actual adequate quality of life, the wage necessary for that, which almost all of our participants were below our region's living wage. So, very important to discuss here is impacts of colonialism, as mentioned by Diana at the onset. So Indigenous participants were overrepresented in our services, attesting to, just really attesting to all the aspects of colonialism and the ongoing impacts of things like residential schools and overrepresentation in child foster care systems and ongoing discrimination and racial exclusion and all of these things. There's a myriad of explanations as to why this overrepresentation exists, and it's also mirrored in overrepresentation of Indigenous people in homelessness and housing precarity. Our findings corroborate this quite strongly with this, as you can see here, with this strong overrepresentation. Our findings also really attest to inequalities, gender-based and based in gender and sexual orientation. So 18% of our survey respondents identified as 2S LGBTQIA+, whereas based on Canadian census figures, 4% of the Canadian population identified as such in 2018. So those who identify as 2S LGBTQIA+ are more likely to have their first experience homelessness as a youth than those who identified as straight and or cisgendered. There are several unique causes of homelessness for gender diverse people. These include homophobic and transphobic violence, discrimination from services based on sexual orientation and or gender identity and expression, systemic discrimination resulting in a lack of inclusive resources, and of course, family conflict connected to homophobia and transphobia. This is all to say that our findings corroborate the overrepresentation of 2S LGBTQIA+ people in housing precarity. So disability is a huge structural factor behind risk of homelessness in our region. So the rate of disability in the program population is, as you can see here, more than 6 times the rate in the general population. This reflects the overrepresentation of people with disabilities in homelessness in general. People who live with disabilities must overcome individual discrimination and systemic inequality to secure and maintain adequate housing. So it is no surprise that people who rely on provincial disability social assistance are overrepresented amongst our program recipients. Also important to note here is the shelter allowance provided to social assistance recipients is grossly inadequate compared to the cost of housing and is a leading cause of homelessness in our region. The rate of social assistance is underlying structural and systemic conditions that cause housing instability and homelessness. It's not the disability itself, of course. Lastly, here we looked at experiences of violence distributed by gender. So participants who identify as women or using non-binary pronouns report experiences of violence at close to double the rate of male-identified participants. This corroborates the research that attests to gender-based violence being a significant contributor to housing instability and homelessness. Women's and gender diverse people's homelessness is linked to both interpersonal violence and economic inequality arising from discriminatory systems, such as the persistent gender pay gap. Violence is also often beginning in childhood as well. Women and gender diverse people experience widespread chronic housing affordability challenges and severe lack of gender-specific or safe emergency supportive and transitional or permanent affordable housing. Okay, so those are a broad kind of like summation of the structural findings that we found. This section is more about the system's failures. So what can we do at the systemic level to kind of like affect positive change? So the pre-assessment form and follow-up survey were not specifically designed to capture any information about systems failures. However, the pre-assessment data includes answers to an open-ended question that invited applicants to provide a reason for applying, of which we selectively coded and got some really meaningful information about their interactions with different systems. So really, common answers had to do with financial assistance ending for applicants or people waiting for financial assistance. These were huge drivers into our programs. The most common, as you can read here, the most common systems gaps identified were government financial support transitions, not enough income, and disability or health issues linked to systemically impoverished income levels or sudden drops in income. So participants in the programs operate very closely to or beyond their financial limits on a monthly basis, making any changes or delays in payments significant for housing security. So this attests to the effectiveness of our program as well, in that our one-time emergency financial assistance have been critical in helping people in their housing crises in these immediate situations. So onto personal circumstances. So these kind of like individual level factors could be thought of as precipitating events that may lead to an episode of homelessness. We can't, however, consider these reasons as a root cause of homelessness, as many individuals face these kind of circumstances, but do not fall into homelessness as a result. So as you can see right here in the graph, so self-reported reasons for seeking program services, underemployment or job loss was the biggest, family or personal crisis coming in very high as well, health crisis very high, many and other explanations as well as vehicle expenses. So the other category is interesting. This demonstrates that it's quite difficult to, it talks about the, it speaks to the multiplicity of reasons that people come into personal crisis that might eventually put them at risk for homelessness, and the difficulties we have in tracking them. Additionally to that, more than a third of participants chose 2 or more reasons for applying. This also demonstrates how factors such as health crisis, job loss, poverty are all interconnected and can compound into, putting people at risk of homelessness. So the wide range of personal crises reinforces the difficulty with attempts to develop interventions based on individual factors such as job loss, family or personal crisis, and it also affirms that individual factors are connected to these broader structural conditions. So it's important to note that people came to our services because they were at risk of losing their housing, in most cases through eviction. Some had already been served eviction notices when they'd come to us as well. So conflict with landlords and evictions have to be considered. And in doing so, it's important to be recognized that they do manifest at the individual level, but the circumstances in which these disruptions occur are mediated by policies, laws, and access to justice. So we really do have to consider the structural and systemic issues that mitigate landlord-tenant disputes as individual circumstances. And so just to sum up here, or just before we sum up here, we had taken these findings to 2 roundtable discussions held with 2 separate groups. So a couple months ago, we took it to a group of local stakeholders, local and national stakeholders, followed by a group of people with lived and living experience of homelessness, to kind of gauge their perspective on our findings, to strengthen our report, and to try to incite a discussion as to what we should suggest as future action, which I think is really important. So so they really did contribute important insights to enrich our findings. So while the stakeholders groups emphasize the need for better programs and programs integration in our region, both stakeholders and people experiencing homelessness suggested homelessness prevention should focus on resolving the underlying roots that cause homelessness, such as the structural factors that we've discussed. So lack of income, lack of affordable housing, various forms of discrimination and inequity. So interesting as well, both groups identified the need for better tracking of individuals and families at risk of homelessness, which I also think is very important. This was on top of some specific policy suggestions, so some of which provided by people with lived experience included ensuring everyone on social assistance has an income equal to or above the poverty line and pays only 30% of their income on rent, and various policies surrounding reducing landlord discrimination. So just to wrap up here really quickly, I think we're doing pretty good with time. So really what these findings speak to are that structural inequities and systems failures are eroding resilience and pushing households into housing need. This is making households more vulnerable to a homelessness event due to a personal crisis. So particular consideration and should be given towards vulnerable groups, such as 2S LGBTQIA+, the youth, women fleeing violence, single parents, people with diverse abilities, newcomers and indigenous households, as well as people of color. Those are what our findings kind of point towards. What should be taken into account, though, and emphasized strongly, is that the most important drivers of homelessness identified in our analysis were unaffordable housing costs and high rates of poverty, the inability essentially to afford housing, which should be, I think, quite obvious. So what now? So the program data reveals, the effectiveness of our programs, and it attests to the need to expand these programs and develop more upstream initiatives to prevent homelessness. At the same time, we should be seeking policy solutions to move beyond just emergency interventions and to focus on the underlying issues that are driving people into housing crisis and into homelessness. So core housing need is a really valuable indicator as well of households being at risk of homelessness. And efforts should be made to bring households out of core housing need by providing them affordable housing, either through increasing their income or decreasing their housing costs. So that is the findings of our report for now. So I'd like to introduce, or maybe Diana can do the introduction.
No, you can go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sure. So we have one of our staff members here who is going to speak about her experience as a service recipient of our programming. So, and I think this will really shed light on, just the scale of our crisis and, in addition to the effectiveness of our programs. But anyway, Stephanie, if you're there, you can take over at any time.
Okay, thanks, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
So I was actually asked 3 questions, so I thought I'd just talk to them. So what brought me into the housing crisis was I had an unexpected medical issue that required short-term leave from my employment. When the short-term ended, I was under pressure to return to work, which I was unable to perform the tasks. And my long-term claim was under investigation, which in the end was never able to be approved. So through that, how did the housing crisis affect my physical, mental, and emotional well-being? It was definitely a lot of sleepless nights, at a loss for further options as where to go. I'm an individual that has rarely ever asked for help. I was uncomfortable, felt vulnerable, embarrassed, questioning how this had even happened, as I usually pride myself on being top of expenses. And how did I benefit from the program? I received funds for 1 month, and it paid a few bills to avoid eviction and disconnection. If I hadn't received assistance, I may have looked to further interest high loans like payday loan or cash money. And if anybody's pretty familiar, they do create a vicious cycle of pretty much like further debt, because if you don't have the means to repay it, then you're penalized that plus like a higher interest rate of, I would say, at least a bare minimum of 30%. And then also I would have been putting more at risk of my parents, putting them in a position where they may not have been able to cover their own expenses. And the last question was it able to stabilize my housing in the long run? And it was. The good news was I wasn't able to return to my current work, but it did allow me, by reducing the stress, it allowed me to cover some expenses until I could put a plan in place, which led to a career change, and then which led to being able to just have a little bit of breathing room until that first paycheck came in. And then it led to further education around financial stability and the awareness of how fast things can happen, even if you think that you're prepared. I mean, I went through all my savings. I went through everything before I had reached out for help, and I was completely depleted. And I was at a loss. So I was pretty thankful that there was something in place like this. Yeah. So hopefully that answers your questions. So,
thank you. Thank you so much for joining us and speaking with your lived experience today. I know that's it's a challenging thing to do, but it's really valuable. And as Stephanie mentioned, she had a career change. We are really grateful to be able to have someone with lived experience on our team that's experienced the program need firsthand. And as part of her career change, Stephanie applied for our case manager job. And so we're really grateful to have her on our team. So thank you. And thank you, Max, for going over the findings. I'll open the floor now to we're going to have a panel and we're going to have a Q&A afterwards and a discussion around what the findings mean for sort of the conversation around homelessness prevention in our region. But first, if there's any specific questions about the findings for Max particularly at this point, let us know. Just throw your hand up in the chat. Not seeing any hands up, so I think we can jump right into our panel, which is great. Excited to hear what they are going to be able to share with us. We have with us today Esther DeVos, who is the Executive Director of Research at BC Housing. Erin Day, whose name's been mentioned in terms of research previously, who's an assistant professor with the Faculty of Human and Social Sciences at Laurier University and a researcher with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. And she's coming to us today from Waterloo. And Hannah Mang-Wooley, who is a tenant legal advocate with Together Against Poverty Society of BC and a tenant herself. So I'm going to start with Erin Day, jumping over to you. Would you be able to give us your sort of off-the-top response to the findings in the context of what's happening at the national level around research and homelessness prevention?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm happy to. Thank you so much for inviting me as an Ontarian sort of dropping into this Victoria meeting. I really appreciate the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to learn about the amazing work that's being done here and be able to maybe connect some of those pieces to what we know is happening at the national level. I was so thrilled when Nicole and Max reached out to me about the work that the Community Social Planning Council was doing, because in the work I've been doing along with Dr. Stephen Gates around homelessness prevention, I mean, the truth of the matter is there's just very little happening around homelessness prevention. And often when we hear the term prevention, it's sort of being slipped in there, right? But without sort of the robustness of what does prevention look like? How do we invest in prevention? And how do we take prevention seriously? And so I was just absolutely elated to see this work being done and the research being connected to the program model around, okay, well, let's see, what works. How can we show that prevention works? One of the biggest challenges with prevention of any kind, homelessness prevention, crime prevention, school dropout prevention, whatever you want to call it, is how do you measure something that didn't happen, right? So how do you, it's hard to say, would somebody become homeless if, without X model, or would somebody have committed a crime, for example, with that X model, or whatever it might be. And so because of those sort of evaluative challenges, it's been really, really tough to get people to buy in to the prevention message. And so I'm just so thrilled to see, here is some data, here is very concrete evidence that the Social Planning Council has provided that can point to, yes, here we see that prevention can work. And so just a real kudos and a real appreciation for what you folks are doing, because it is relatively rare across the country for people to really rally behind this prevention message in such a tangible way. Again, not using the word prevention to maybe get at other things. And why this is so important is because I do research around homelessness. Our model of how do we address homelessness has been to manage emergencies. Homelessness became the crisis that we know it today, really in the 1990s, but relatively quickly. So in the span of just a few years, we saw huge increases in homelessness across the country. And there was just, the support wasn't there. The sector wasn't ready. And so they were using these emergency responses that they'd had for decades, that was meant to manage and help people in really short-term crisis, or people who are moving to a new place and need a little bit of help. That's this model that they had to go with to try to respond to this wave of homelessness. And it's just not meant to be. It's just not how it was designed to work. And so we've been using these emergency responses to try to address what is actually a long-term sustainable social challenge that needs these long-term investments and solutions. And so thankfully, over the last decade, I would say, we saw a transition to housing first. So recognizing, okay, folks who have been homeless for a long time need help and need support to be able to find and maintain stable housing. And that has been a game changer, and it's been fantastic. But it also leaves a gap where you know, to be able to access housing first, for example, you need to be chronically homeless for 6 months or more. And so what it's actually doing inadvertently is saying, well, you have to wait until you're mired in homelessness before we're going to be able to provide you, before you're eligible for those supports. And so this is why we need housing first, but we also need this prevention piece. We need to be working before people are mired in homelessness to be able to support them and not make them go through the trauma and the challenges that come with experiencing homelessness. And so it's an incredibly important moment in time where we are recognizing the need to be turning to prevention. I actually see this as a key component in meeting Canada's obligations on the right to housing, as outlined in the National Housing Strategy. Prevention is how we meet that progressive realization of that right that we all have to housing. And then we know that not only is you know, focusing on prevention the right thing to do, because it just is, but it's more efficient, it's cheaper, it's less disruptive to people's lives. If we can keep people in a home, that's much easier really than having to find a new home and trying to restabilize. And so there's just so much that prevention can do. And but it has been a huge challenge at the national scale to rally people behind the prevention message. People are like, that's a good idea, but it's really hard for people to invest and to really focus on that. And so I think that this report and the work that you folks are doing is going to be a major step in moving the agenda and moving the dial forward in how we think about prevention in Canada. So as a prevention researcher, just a huge thanks to you all for the work you're doing.
Thank you, Erin. Well, it's such enthusiasm. It's really nice to do research and hear that kind of response to it, because so often it's yeah, it's either, you know, it doesn't have an effect. So that our goal is to be applied research that really is speaking to policy and filling holes in the landscape. Now I want to jump over to Esther with BC Housing. Did you have a response sort of in BC context that you would like to add?
Sure, yeah, thanks. I echo Erin's comments around the advantage of this kind of research. I think often those that are precariously homeless are not counted. Our methodologies of sort of determining homelessness don't adequately capture this. There's the Stats Canada census around people who identify being in core housing need. But as we heard from Stephanie's story, that might be a very point in time situation and not something on a longer lasting where it shows up, you know, every 5 years in a census. And so really understanding the dynamics behind precarious housing and that potential to go into homelessness, particularly in a really tight market like Victoria has. You know, as Erin said, like it's better for people to be able to stay housed. I mean, hopefully they're also living in adequate and suitable housing as well as affordable for them, because we wouldn't want people to live in inadequate housing. But especially for those who may have housing that is particularly set up for their needs, whether that's having them rooted in a community of care, or close to their children's school, or where the housing is set up to accommodate diverse abilities and it works for them. I think even more so, that's a key piece. That prevention piece is even more important because it may just be that point in time, that one time that can really make a difference in someone's world, as we heard from Stephanie, and really avert the sort of pathway into homelessness. And as Erin said, like both pieces need to be talked about, and moving away from sort of just an emergency-based model to prevention and looking at different ways of engaging in prevention. And I think this really highlights how we can start talking about it. Thanks.
Great. And Hannah from Together Against Poverty Society, did you want to add something around your response to the findings?
Certainly, thanks so much. And I really appreciate the perspectives of everyone who's spoken so far. So just by way of introduction, my name's Mang-Wooley. I'm a tenant advocate with Together Against Poverty Society. So I provide legal advice and representation to low-income tenants in Greater Victoria. A number of the tenants that I work with have accessed the rent bank and other emergency funds. And so, yeah, I've certainly seen firsthand how important this kind of program is for preventing homelessness. Also, I just wanted to mention that as Diana said, I'm also a tenant myself. I've rented in Victoria for almost 11 years. And in that time, I myself have been displaced twice, once by what I believe to be a bad faith landlord's use eviction, and then most recently, just in the last couple months, due to my landlord selling the house that I was living in. This is a really common experience for tenants in Victoria, especially for low-income tenants, but even for folks of moderate to upper income. The market is so tight right now that this is really it's a push for many tenants. I would say this report is really helpful in just giving statistics to the things that we on the front line see. Being able to say that 96.5% of the people who were surveyed pay more than 30% of their income on rent, and 77.5% pay more than 50% of their income on rent. Those are staggering statistics, honestly. With 30% of income considered to be affordable housing, that means that 77.5% of the people who who are accessing this program are at imminent risk of homelessness, basically, at any time. And yeah, I would, these definitely show that homelessness prevention is completely necessary. Also, that there's a desperate need for policy interventions at this point. Essentially, tenants have been at the whim of market factors that are beyond their control, such as lack of housing, like particularly affordable housing, and in addition to strong demand, which is just driving up the cost of housing to an alarming degree. And there's policy issues under, say, the Residential Tenancy Act. For instance, there's in BC, there's rent control for people who are currently living in a unit, but as soon as that unit becomes vacant, then a landlord can increase the rent to whatever degree they want. So we're seeing that is a huge factor increasing the cost of housing. And also it means that landlords have a significant, they have a significant incentive to evict their tenants, particularly long-term tenants who are paying affordable rent. So we believe that one of the policies that really should come from this data is that rent should be controlled on vacant units, meaning that a landlord wouldn't be able to raise rents between tenancies, which would essentially remove this incentive to evict tenants. And it would help to try and cap these kind of runaway housing prices, which are just putting so many people at risk. So yeah, certainly we think that seeing policy change as a result of this kind of research is very important, and certainly getting some hard numbers is a really key piece of pushing forward policy initiatives. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks so much for your comments and your insights as a tenant in the current housing market. There's a few interesting questions coming up in the discussion, and one of them is whether or not, aimed towards Hannah, that our low and middle income strata now pushing low income and underclass of housing. I'm not sure if you can make sense of that question, but the idea that strata is pushing out the low and underclass from the housing market.
I mean, certainly, yeah, one of the market factors is that building rental income, or building rental housing, is often not a very good investment for someone who is trying to make a lot of money. Creating strata units is a lot more profitable. So that's something that, when if it's just up to developers, then they're going to look toward getting people to buy their units rather than renting it out. That's just sort of that's just kind of a basic underlying thing. So that's certainly a problem. I mean, another issue that we see is current rental stock being bought out by large companies, such as like real estate investment trusts, which their whole reason for being is to try and increase the cost. They're trying to extract as much money out of housing as they possibly can. So in some cases, that means that large corporate landlords are taking over the job of what, you know, an individual landlord who probably has ties to the tenants and to their communities. It's now these large corporate landlords that just they're just in it for the money. So that also puts tenants at risk.
Thank you. Do either of the other speakers want to jump in, Esther or Erin, on this idea of kind of the investment push and strata push on housing availability?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I was thinking as Hannah was speaking, the other piece that is also underlying all of this is that sort of normalized narrative that we've had in our society, where rental is for a period of time and then you eventually move into the home ownership market. And so because our systems and our policies have sort of wrapped around this narrative, what's happened is that as people aren't able to move into home ownership, they're staying in rental markets for longer and pushing out. And because it's becoming more expensive, they're also maybe a higher sort of income bracket sort of household, but they're looking for affordability as well. And so it ends up being this cascading negative approach where people are just more and more pushed out of the housing market, and even what maybe previously would have been considered affordable housing because it's taken up with other folks. And then you have the compounding factors of the fact that landlords are able to raise the rents as they have vacant units, and you know, a lot of, I think at the end of the day, we have to also just acknowledge that the market can't answer all of the challenges here. And, you know, prevention is certainly something that is calling for policy intervention and government response, but also too is looking at our housing system as a whole. So for a long time, we've been focused on home ownership and then sort of separated out affordable housing and particularly publicly led affordable housing and sort of considered it outside. It was intended to be outside of the market right from the get-go when it first developed in the 60s and 70s. And so if we see it as a full continuum or a full system, I think then we'll better understand how the different factors really impact, and then even create this systemic structural mess that even further negatively impacts those that are low income or belonging to other marginalized populations that are facing incredible barriers to housing stability and personal circumstances aside, even just day-to-day living in terms of having a quality of life with a strong sense of well-being, with, you know, food security, mental health security, physical health security. Those are all really important considerations and not easily achievable when you are worried about making sure you have a house or a roof over your head.
Thank you so much. There's some, feel free please to just kind of pile in on the chat. It's probably the easiest way for us to facilitate back and forthing with the participants in the room. Somebody mentioned that the Tenant Advisory Committee from Victoria has put forward a motion that's headed to the Union of BC municipalities to implement to support vacancy control, so limiting rent increases between vacancies. Folks can join that effort and by contacting Sarah Potts, whose email's in the chat. And we do, in the report, we do speak to vacancy control because it is something that we've seen increasing numbers, and we don't have data because it isn't part of the systematic collection of data of sort of that rent eviction, demoviction, and ending of tenancy that's for questionable reasons. But we did see a massive increase over the last sort of 6 months or 8 months of individuals who were being evicted because their house was going up for sale or being renovated, and that came to our rent bank because they were in our programs because they were in transition and really weren't financially set up to do a transition. So certainly something that we want to do more data collection and study on, but of course the market's changing. We'll have to see what that means as the sales start to slow down. And then somebody asked about a basic income approach. And I know that this is something that BC government looked at and rejected. There was a big panel that reviewed basic income and the existing programs and sort of supported bolstering existing programs versus implementing a separate basic income program. But the person that asked this question asked if Ms. Day could maybe speak to some of the efforts in Ontario around this, and maybe all of the panel could speak to the concept of a basic income as part of the answer here.
Yeah, I wish I had more good news about Ontario. I mean, as I'm sure many of you know, it was a really cool pilot program happening. And then when the Ford government took over, they scrapped it mid-study. And as a researcher, besides the my advocacy that I wanted to see it going, as a researcher, to stop a study midway, let's just get this, let's finish collecting the data before we can tell you if this is something that should be scrapped or shouldn't be. And so we don't have the data from it because I didn't know. There's been some incredible projects. For example, there was a photography project that looked at for folks who had been on it before it was scrapped, what it meant to them. And there were these incredible stories of people who were able to go back to school, people who were able to put their kids in daycare so that they could go to work, that the ends met because of basic income and things like that. So there's lots of promise there, but we just don't know because it didn't see its way to fruition.
Thanks, Erin. Do either of the others, Esther or Hannah, want to step in on that one as well?
I don't have anything to really sort of say other than it would have been really nice to see the results of that study. I was personally much more optimistic about that coming to fruition in the sort of first year of the pandemic with the CERB. And there's a lot of discussion across Canada around maybe moving to a situation of having a guaranteed basic income, and for whatever reason, it's fallen off the policy table and discussions in the way that it did present itself in that first year. I also just wanted to touch, if I may, on Eric's question around the combined costs of housing and transportation. Certainly that is a huge consideration because it creates additional costs for people who are already challenged in finding housing affordability and housing suitability. So and adequacy. So where we don't want to have happen is where people are pushed into having affordable housing by the 30% mark, but living in places that are really untenable for someone to live with dignity. And so the combined cost is something to very much be weary of. I don't know if we have all of the answers. I know that there's a push to really do that 15-minute walkable community and transit-oriented development. I think that's still relatively new to see whether or not that will result in enough affordable housing around those developments, as opposed to still being just other ways of displacing people, because certainly there's a lot of people who would like access to good transit. But it is certainly something that we need to consider because, and as we saw in this study, with 8% of the respondents even saying like the vehicle expense was their major sort of personal circumstance that impacted that. And I would hazard a guess that it was probably even higher for some people, and they may have just been able to access lines of credit or savings in some other way, or had family that were able to help out. Which, as Stephanie pointed out, there's only so much that you can do that before you're fully depleted, and it also assumes that you have family and friends who are in a position to be able to help you. And then we're also putting people in further danger of incurring more debt, which we know as inflation is going up and interest rates are rising, just creates even more of a crunch on people. So certainly something that we definitely need to look at, and then climate action and adaptation and resilience, and making sure that we are finding solutions that are beneficial and inclusive of people who are low income and other marginalized communities, rather than just only thinking about one particular demographic as we design our climate solutions.
Thanks very much. And thanks for raising the comments, Eric. The Community Social Planning Council has a transportation ACES program. It's a climate equity program looking at transportation, and that nexus of housing and affordability and transportation costs is really one that it reflects the similar demographics to what we see in this study, that the folks that are most challenged by transportation costs are low income. And then there's discrimination, gender, single parents that are disproportionately challenged by transportation access. They have to work multiple jobs, they have to work shift work, or people with disabilities who have challenges with having to take multiple trips in order to get groceries because they can only carry a little bit on transit. So there's lots of issues around equity with regards to access to transit. And then of course the community, we've seen some great studies around the health impacts of long commutes and also the family impacts of long commutes, because it undermines time for people to be spending with children and families. So lots of really important equity considerations around how we talk about addressing affordability that brings low income and vulnerable households into that conversation. Does anybody else want to jump in on that point? Okay, well, we're closing in on 1 o'clock, and I know that we were going to go to 1:30, but if a lot of people have to leave at the end of the lunch hour, so just is there any other burning questions that folks want to raise a hand or put in the chat, and then maybe we can do a panel wrap up early if not. Give a minute or so. I'm not seeing any hands go up in the audience.
I wanted to speak to a question that Rose put in the chat. She asked about any legal challenges that have happened around this. And I just wanted to point to, I'm actually going to put in the chat because I'm a little bit worried I'm going to pronounce it incorrectly, but Tanjujaja versus Canada in 2014. It was a class action lawsuit that they brought to the federal government saying it's 30 years of policy decisions and decisions that have been made at the federal level in particular that have led to the housing and homelessness crisis that we're in today. And they argued that it's these a grouping of policy decisions that violated Section 7 of the Charter. And Section 7 of the Charter is the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, as well as Section 15, equality rights. But unfortunately, the courts denied that case because they just didn't have the mechanism to think about more than one law at once. Like they were like, "Whoa, we can't do this. You're asking about coming together of policies. We do one law. Is it a violation?" And so they couldn't do it. And it's really disappointing that they weren't able to do it. But it was very brave of that group of people, and I just have so much respect for them that they did bring that class action lawsuit in 2014. And then the other thing I'll just mention quickly is, a few weeks ago, I believe 2 weeks ago, our new federal housing advocate launched the submission portal to be able to submit a claim for a human rights violation. And, I do know that there's some folks putting together some pretty sophisticated, some pretty, robust submissions, but also anybody can submit. Any individual or any group can submit a claim, and you submit through this form. And it actually, at its most basic level, would actually take about an hour to submit. And so I'm actually pushing in my city where we're facing encampment evictions. I'm really pushing for them to file a submission there, because even if the federal housing advocate doesn't take that submission, we can use the filing of the submission itself as leverage to push for upholding these human rights to housing. So I just wanted to point to those two things.
Great. Esther, did you have a few wrap-up words?
I just think that this has been a really great starting point for this conversation, and hopefully not the end of this around all of the different actions that we can take around prevention. And along the same lines that Erin was talking about, that particular case from 2014, we now have in legislation in the National Housing Strategy Act of 2019, the right to housing actually enshrined in law. It's not in the charter, but which does raise some other legal considerations. But it is now in law, and it hasn't really been well operationalized yet. So we don't really know what that means. And I think that there is some really interesting opportunities to address some of the issues that people have brought up here within that rights framework. And so hopefully, as we continue these discussions, we can also link back to some of the pieces that have already been put in place, whether that's going through the Advocate, the National Housing Council, or even on a more local or provincial scale, for sure. So thank you for getting this research out and sharing it with the world, and looking forward to what we can leverage off of this to better understand the situation in Greater Victoria, but also elsewhere as it comes to prevention of homelessness.
Yeah, I wish our experience was more unique, but looking at across the province, certainly we probably would be seeing very similar patterns. Hannah, did you have any final comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I think, you know, one of the really great things about the report, one of my favorite parts to read, in fact, was the part that came out of the roundtable from people with lived experience. I think that their voices are so important and really cut to the chase around what this is all about. And essentially, one of the comments really struck me was basically that, like, folks know what they need. They need enough money to be able to pay for their housing, and they need housing that's not going to keep increasing and increasing. They need protections, and they need protection from discrimination based on their income and other factors. So those are, and those are very actionable. These are, one of the things that's pointed out in the report is the fact that, disability income assistance rates, the base income is $1,358, whereas the median rent for a studio apartment in March 2022 was over $1,700. So those things don't work out, right? So there needs to be action to cap rents. There needs to be action to increase the supply of affordable rents. And I think we really need to take the power for housing out of the hands of the landlords, put it into the hands of the tenants, and create strategies at the government level in order to put controls on these. Because one of the things that I think is important to remember is that all of these things that are so bad for tenants are great for landlords. They're making so much money right now, and that's often why they're in it, right? Is to make money. So, and they also have a really loud voice when they're talking to, when they're speaking to people in power. They're the ones who are able to control the supply. They're the ones who can put limits on. They can say, oh, well, we won't increase the supply if you put these things in place. But there's also there's way more tenants, there's way more people power, which comes from the tenants. So really, building up groups of tenants and getting our voices heard is, I think, really key to changing policies that will actually make an impact for people.
Thanks. Well, I really just want to tell everybody in the room how much we appreciate you having taken the time today to come and engage with us around this research, and to our panel members for taking the time to review it and provide feedback and engage around the discussion. And also to the report authors, and finally to the funders. SPARC-BC is a funder under the BC government's Housing Action Fund, and then the BC Rent Bank was a big partner with us around being able to access and use the data. So grateful to our partners and collaborators, our researchers, and to everybody for coming today. The research is only as good as it is used, and so we hope that this is the beginning of more conversations around homelessness prevention. Thank you for coming today.